Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom.
And me, Rob.
And hello to our returning viewers and listeners, but also we have noticed we have a number of new listeners in the past month or so, haven't we, Rob?
Yeah, we have. Welcome to everybody that's new to the 1895 podcast. Fantastic to have you with us for the journey. No doubt buoyed by a lot of the recent news agenda, all of the impacts on supply chains in the Middle East and back here in Europe.
Yeah, we've been covering that extensively on the podcast, haven't we? 7 or 8 episodes, I think, that we've focused in on, well, the Iran conflict and surrounding topics. So yeah, no surprise that we've got a few new listeners. So hopefully they enjoy this one as well.
Hopefully, yeah. For context for everyone that is new to the show, the 1895 podcast, of course, with our name, we are paying homage to one of the forefathers of the global industrial gases business, Carl von Linde, and his pioneer in liquefaction of air back in 1895, which would later go on to form essentially the backbone of the industrial gases business. So that's our name, that's why we're here.
No, don't give too much away, because we should maybe point listeners back to our very first episode where we really got into it. But this episode, we're going to be focusing on one of the hottest topics and one of the topics we find ourselves discussing the most, aren't we?
We are. That is the beauty of this pod, that we do get to talk about all things gases, energy, current affairs, and really how it affects the industry and our listeners. And on this instance, yes, we have another familiar topic back in the headlines, CO2 shortages.
Yes, so the story here, or the headlines, I suppose, is that media outlets, particularly here in the UK, are reporting that the UK, what they're saying, could face gaps on supermarket shelves for food and beverages this summer if the war in Iran continues. These reports from The Times, The Guardian, The Independent, ITN, BBC, Telegraph, a lot of established and well-respected publications too. So if we delve a little bit deeper into that story, it goes a bit further than that headline suggests, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I mean, so this has once again reignited very familiar concerns across the food and beverages sector in particular. And for many, it will feel like deja vu. It certainly does for us, doesn't it? And we've certainly been here before. We only have to look back to summer 2018. We had probably the biggest and highest profile CO2 shortages back then across Europe, UK in particular, and we actually saw a similar perfect storm of events in North America as well. So that was a huge story. I think it really vaulted CO2 and merchant CO2 supply chains into the public consciousness more than ever before. And since then, there's a lot more awareness now. So the story keeps emerging. Even when the market's tight, it can be misconstrued for shortages. We did see a recurrence of shortages in, I would say, summer and autumn 2021. Again, back in the headlines, back in the public consciousness, and in many respects, the government consciousness. So yeah, a very familiar story, and we're back here again. But I think the important distinction this time is we're not seeing a shortage at the moment, and that is gasworld's understanding. We have a firm grip on this market. We speak to the people in the market too. There are always pockets of tightness. There are occasionally pockets of allocation, but there is no widespread shortage, and that's really being misread. I think that's the shame of this story this week.
Yeah, so back up to today, if you read further than the headline suggests, the actual story is that ministers here in the UK, so that the Cobra Emergency Committee, they're drawing up contingency plans for what they're calling a reasonable worst case scenario if this conflict in the Middle East continues, and if, in particularly, that key waterway in the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Number 10 have run a planning operation named Exercise Turnstone to rehearse the various scenarios of how British industry could be affected by a long closure of the strait. So like you say, perhaps we've learned those lessons, that those tough lessons from 2018 and 2021.
Well, I personally think this is the most refreshing part of the story, if you will, and that's what I wrote overnight on the gasworld website, that actually I do think this shows signs of progress in the CO2 conversation. It shows that the lessons are finally being learned, publicly at least. Perhaps they always were, but it didn't feel that way. But yeah, the lessons are being learned. I mean, we saw the government announce support and significant financial support, £100 million of funding to essentially restart or reopen the ENSIS plant in the north of
Mothballed
the
in
UK.
August last year, so bring that back online already.
Exactly, yeah, and it's a pragmatic move, and I think there were extensive discussions and a package of financial support with 100 million were agreed with the Department for Business and Trade for that plant to remain on standby and ready to start up as required. And I think as of yesterday, we understand it has started up. And for context, for anyone that's listening, these things aren't just an instant startup. You often have to sort of reawaken and warm up these plants, whatever the gas, over a longer period of time. It's not just a start-stop operation. So good to see that happening. And as I said, I think it's refreshing that clearly CO2 in 2026 is finally recognised as part of the critical infrastructure. It's finally got the recognition it deserves in many respects, because it could grind certain industries and aspects of the economy to a halt. And it's great that the government is including it in its worst case planning scenario. And that's what this story is. There isn't a shortage as it stands. It's sort of been misread, the signals, because the government is trying to say, we're planning for that, we're anticipating for that, and these are the measures we would put in place as an air of caution, and yet everybody's jumped on it as if there's suddenly a shortage.
So is this different from last time? Look, I was just starting out in this industry in 2021, obviously when that was that last big shortage here in the UK. I had no real idea of the industry in 2018. You've worked here throughout all of that. So why is this time so much different?
Well, in a nutshell, there is no shortage. In those instances that you referred to, the market was already tight and did tip into shortage. We actually saw CO2 supply coming off the table. Various reasons for that. They often tend to be converging on the same points in terms of you either see some routine or unplanned maintenance of various plants. That might be fertilizer plants, it might be the CO2 plant itself, and it's essentially offline or off stream, as we call it, for longer than planned, and that can start to create a drag on supply and potentially tip into shortage. In 2018, we saw a perfect storm of dynamics essentially creating that. You had very high natural gas prices, squeezed margins on the fertilizer side in Europe, and we saw plants curtailed and one by one taken offline. Pretty quickly you see an impact on an already strained CO2 market. So in those instances, CO2 supply was taken off the table. We did also have kind of peak season for demand going into summers. I think that was a World Cup year in 2018, in fact.
Yep.
So similar circumstances. But as I said, the big differentiation this time is there is not yet a CO2 shortage. And actually, there's not sight of one either. This is all theoretical. And as the government has said, it's worst case planning.
To play devil's advocate, I suppose, those structural vulnerabilities do still remain in the industry, though. So although there's no shortage now, there's no sign of a shortage, we are still teetering on that edge, are we?
We're always tight, I think. And for context, well, you and I were both in Rotterdam in the Netherlands for gasworld's European CO2 Summit 2026, just 3 weeks ago? Yeah. Maybe 4 now.
Where's that time gone?
Time's flying by. And it was actually just as the whole Iran conflict was escalating quite rapidly. We did some emergency episodes from live on the ground. But yeah, we knew back then there was an air of caution, if not concern, creeping into the market. We had tracked that at Gasworld in our confidence reports, which is like an industry sentiment tracker. Pre-event, we went into the event and all the talk was around Iran and a tight market. And as you know, Tom, the general consensus was it is perennially tight. It's not really improved massively, but it's not deteriorated really since 2021-22 either. So it's been in a a stable state. I wouldn't say plentiful, but I wouldn't say troubled. It's been in a stable state for sort of 3 to 4 years now, but it's tight. And as is often the case with these structural vulnerabilities, the slightest thing can change that balance overnight. So yeah, it's tight going into this.
But I guess coming back to the overarching story, that's why it's a good thing that these UK ministers, or the COBRA Emergency Committee, are looking at this and trying to get on top of it before it becomes a shortage.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we've not publicly seen that previously. In fact, it's always felt like a very reactive measure. And back in 2021, when the government was actively propping up one of the plants in the UK north, again, it was a reactive measure. It felt kind of like a false economy because it could have potentially been headed off rather at the pass long before that. Whereas in this instance, we're seeing that actively modelled, and I think that's a great thing to see. So actually, for once, I'm giving a big pat on the back for the UK government here.
And how is you mentioned some of the sentiment that we gauged at our Rotterdam European CO2 summit. How is that sentiment in supply of security and CO2 translated to now? Do we have any figures on that?
I think from what I was looking at last night, actually, funnily enough, it's not worsened, but it's also not entirely recovered. So sentiment is stable, but perhaps on the concern side is probably the best way to describe it. There's been no change since March and April in our sentiment tracking. What is perhaps the sort of double concern there is, despite there being this temporary ceasefire at the moment, and despite there being no signs of a crisis yet, confidence isn't restored. We're just not seeing that go up at the moment. So it looks like everybody has a feeling of we're on the edge. We are on the edge.
We'll have to have a deeper dive into that whole conflict and an update on the conflict, because it's been a few weeks since we've covered it in any real depth on the podcast or on a webinar at least. So
I think we should redress we'll redress the state of play. I think,
then we can return to the topic of CO2, and we'll get into helium as well.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's what's happening right now. What does the outlook for this market look like?
So I think to answer that, we'd have to address where we are now and what the problem is, essentially, if there is one. So at the moment, we are not seeing a situation of shortage in the UK or in Europe, I should stress. That doesn't mean it won't happen. Those structural fragilities that we talked about, they're baked into the CO2 supply chain, and that means that situation can change overnight. There could, a plant could go down, or a problem with the Strait of Hormuz and further restrictions on shipments and so on, and natural gas prices rise, and suddenly we could face a situation. In that respect, government and industry are right to be wary of the continued restriction on the Strait of Hormuz and the knock-on effects of that. If we were to see a shortage, as I explained earlier, it's usually quite seasonal, so you'd expect it between spring and autumn. And if any of the conflict effects with Iran do come into view, then that will obviously create a whole new perfect storm, particularly in a World Cup year. Again, the longest World Cup, 39 days, I think. You expect to see the beverages and the beers flowing alongside all the barbecues and that chicken sizzling on there. So you could have a perfect storm of scenarios there if this does come into view. I guess that's why the government is actively mapping this as well. So yeah, there is a potential, but at the time of speaking, we do not see any major shortage impacts in the Europe or the UK.
And of course, we'll continue speaking to our industry. We'll continue to keep our eyes on this. So if anything does change, that'll be gasworld.com. We'll no doubt discuss it here on our podcast as well.
We will.
Thanks for joining me for that conversation, Rob. Great to delve into that, and this won't be the last time we discuss this, no doubt, will it?
Always a pleasure, Tom. And let's do that Iran update. I think we should get into that.
I think we should. Next week, like you say, we'll do that Iran update, and then we'll get further into, CO2 content maybe in a couple of weeks' time. We've already got plenty out there from the last few weeks, haven't we?
Plenty of it, and I think it's got added resonance now, even though it's a few weeks on from that summit in Rotterdam. It's all so important to the conversations that are happening right now with this UK situation.
Yeah, so listeners, go back and listen to that on the 1895 podcast. There's, of course, coverage on the Middle Eastern conflict as well and what it means for energy, CO2, industrial gases, helium. So again, please go back to listen to that. And in the meantime, do like, follow and share the 1895 podcast, and we'll be back again next week.